All right, well, I think I'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. And the way I'd like to approach this, hold on 1 second, let me just change one little thing with my configuration just to make sure this works more appropriately. Okay, so hopefully you can see this okay. Welcome to the session. I'm Tim. I'm at the University of Michigan. I'm a methodologist. I specialize in mixed methods research, meaning that all of my studies and my methodological work spans both the qualitative component of a study, a quantitative component, and then integrating the two or mixing the two. So I do quite a bit of statistical analysis, and I'm also familiar with a stats module within MAXQDA stats. And that's what I'm going to be sharing with you and talking to you about a little bit. So I do want to just briefly mention the use of variables, because this is all really contingent on the idea that you do have variables in your project. And then we'll look at some of the stats specific features of MAXQDA as well. So for one, you might have a study, for instance, where you can add document variables to it. So a document variable can be attached to any document within your document system of MAXQDA. So if an interview, for instance, is a document, a transcript from an interview, you could attach a variable to that. You can add those variables manually. So MAXQDA already includes some system variables for each document, but you can add new ones. So it could be demographic characteristics, or perhaps you have a mixed method study and you have survey data for that participant, or organizational data. Maybe it's employee data, or it's patients and you have test results or some other kinds of measures, or if it's educational data, you might have assessment results, something else like that. So you can add those variables, attach them to a document. You can do that manually, and we'll look at how to do that in just a moment. Or you can also export from an external file. So for example, an Excel spreadsheet. You can establish what type of variable you want it to be. So MAXQDA does allow you different types of variables. And then as part of this, you can activate by variable as well. So that could become really helpful. If you say that you would want to activate, everyone who's over the age of 25, assuming you have that variable in there, you could do so quite easily. And of course, variables are necessary then for the stats package as well. Along with that, if you do have variables attached, you can display that. There's an option to turn this on or off within Retrieve segment. So I just want to show this little excerpt of my Retrieve segment. So I have my site number, which is a variable. I have an actual rate. It's a performance outcome. So it's 34.30. That's on there. And then I have some categorical variables as well. So academic status, and then also performance level, which was grouped for this particular study. So all of those you can also display in your Retrieve segments. But what that also allows you to do is it allows you to access the stats module as well. So before I continue on and talk much more about the stats module, I just want to take a moment and I want to share variables, some information about variables. So we'll look at a MAXQDA project just so that we can orient to where that is and what that looks like. So I'm just going to share my screen in a different way so you can see my full desktop and my full screen now. All right, so moving over to a MAXQDA file. This is just the one of the example projects within MAXQDA. I use variables in most of my studies because I think it's important to be able to describe participants. For a mixed method study, it becomes increasingly important if I want to integrate quantitative data as well. So we can access variables in a couple of different ways, but we can go to this option here for variables, and then it opens a ribbon that gives you access to lots of other options as well. So starting with a list of document variables, I'll click on that. So everything that you see here in red, that's a system generated variable. in MAXQDA. All of these in blue have been added, essentially. So as I mentioned before, you can add these manually. So we go to this little icon. It's sort of horizontal lines with a plus, hover over it, and I see that it's a new variable. So I can click that, and then it gives me an option to specify the variable. So let's just go ahead and add one, performance score. And then I can specify the type. So it could be text, integer, decimal, date, time, or a Boolean, a true, false as well. I'll just say that this is an integer. We can specify missing values. So let's say that we're using 999 to code a missing value. I'll go ahead and enter that. And then we can note that this is a categorical variable as well. So click OK, and you see that that variable was added here to the bottom. Try to click off that so you can actually read it. So performance score. We can delete a variable as well if we want to change it. So again, you know, all of this is important as we're building to the use of the stats package. So that's what it looks like. And this is what I think of as more of a variable view. So kind of a list of your variables. We can also look at a data editor, and this is more like a spreadsheet. So there's a couple of ways to do this. So from our list of document variables, I can click on this icon to switch over to my data editor, or I could come back to the ribbon and I could click on the icon for the data editor. So this is essentially, you know, it looks like a spreadsheet. So you have rows. For in this case, it's a survey response within this example project, and then each column represents a variable. So again, these are different types of variables. There's integer, categorical, there's a Boolean variable as well, and so on. So a true, false variable. So this can become a starting point then for moving on to the stats package. As I mentioned before, you could also import variables from an external document. So I can select import document variables, and then I can navigate to say an Excel file, and I can import those as well. So I'll come over to the stats package, and I want to move back to the slides now and just talk through some of these features before we come back to MAXQDA and look at how to use those. But when you enter the stats package, you have options. So for one, I can start with all documents, and basically that's going to take all of my document variables, and it's going to use that as my data set. However, I could also start with an external file as well. So I can access a file that's completely different, not connected to my qualitative data sources or qualitative documents within MAXQDA. So that is absolutely an option. And you can enter your own data if you don't have it stored elsewhere too. You can enter it right within MAXQDA. But let me come back over to the slides and just talk a little bit more about the stats module. So I'd like to give a little bit of a overview as far as, you know, why you might use this, and then we'll look at some of the key features of the stats module. So if you're wondering why you might use this, I think that it could be really helpful for mixed method studies. It gives you a stats package so that you can have all of your data within a single program. So I could have my quantitative data, my qualitative data just in, you know, we could think of as the traditional qualitative side of MAXQDA. And then I could bring in document variables, or I could open an external data set so that I can also have my quantitative data stored within the same project file, if you will, especially if it's a document variable, have all of that together. That could be really helpful. And I should say, you don't have to have related qualitative data. You could just be conducting a purely quantitative analysis within the stats module by accessing an external data set. That's completely okay as well. What's really helpful about the stats module is that as you're running an analysis, we'll look at this in a second, we can save that specific output that we want to have from each analysis for inclusion in reports, for instance. And it doesn't, by default, it doesn't just put everything in the output. It allows you to select what actually goes into that output file. And then it becomes really easy to access that later on. For mixed methods analysis, if you're doing that, I think the stats module is also really helpful. So you could conduct statistical analysis on the same participants as included in the qualitative strand of your study. So if you have document variables for your participants, you could then run statistical analysis. And that could mean descriptive statistics, could mean frequencies, it could mean correlations or t-test analysis of variance. We'll look at these options in just a moment. It can also be helpful if you're iteratively going back and forth between your qualitative and quantitative data. So perhaps you've run an analysis using the stats module, that might generate new questions or new ideas. You could then, within the same program, go back to your qualitative data and perhaps code differently or look for evidence of something that you might have found. You could sort of follow a thread, if you will, as new questions arise. So it really does help that iterative process as you are integrating in a mixed method study. So some of the features of the module, as I mentioned before, you can use internal variables, so drawing from those document variables, or you could use external data as well. So I could open up an external file, say from an Excel spreadsheet. Within that, you can calculate descriptive statistics. You could also calculate frequencies as well. So descriptives, things like mean, median, mode, standard deviation, variance. We'll look at all of the options as we go over through that. You could also analyze different types of survey items. So for example, and this is a new feature in the most recent release, if you have multiple response options on a survey, so a question where it was, click all that apply. Say it asks, what was your reason for doing something? Click all that apply. It can handle those kinds of sets too. Can also create sort of a matrix of a set of items, if you will. So if you have a set of items that belong to a scale, for instance, you could designate those as matrix items. So it kind of groups all of those together for you. It then allows you to do quite a few inferential tests. And we'll go through these. So for one, you could conduct a crosstab, which, a crosstab is more descriptive, not inferential, but allows you to then calculate a chi-square or a contingency coefficient C or Kramer's V, for instance. So you can calculate relationships among categorical data. You can conduct t-tests. You could also conduct a Mann-Whitney U-test. So if you're comparing two different groups, there are options in order to do so. You can calculate an analysis of variance as well. There are options for correlation, including a Pearson and also a Spearman. You can conduct cluster analysis, so looking at essentially groupings of variables. And then there are some options for scale analysis as well, so calculating a coefficient alpha if you're looking at internal consistency, reliability, for instance. But let's talk about each of these. So for one, when we go over to the stats module in just a moment, it gives you this data editor. It looks very similar to what we have already looked at within the data editor for document variables. And it gives you options. So if we look at the very bottom of this list for the data editor, or to see the variable list, so this is a list of all of our variables, and then an output viewer. So you can go back and forth between these, and we'll look at these in just a moment. You can calculate descriptive statistics. Here's just an output of descriptives. So we have N, so an indication of your sample size, mean, standard deviation, minimum, maximum, and then it indicated how many missing values you might have as well. I mentioned the output viewer. So as you calculate or run some kind of statistical analysis, you can then choose to save it in the output viewer. And again, it's your choice what to include. There are times where you might, run something and you realize that you, say, forgot to include a variable that you wanted. That is something that you could then choose to just not save to your output viewer. You can select what goes in there. So, wait till you actually have something you want to save and then save it to the output viewer. But at this point, I think we'll go back over to MAXQDA. And I will, I'm just going to check the chat here. So the question, iteratively going back and forth between qual and quant data is powerful, great advantage. Is it true the stats module will run only on document speaker variables, not code variables? I believe that is still true. I believe it's just document variables, but someone else please correct me if that's not the case. I've only used it on document variables or an external data set. So I'm back in the example project, the work-life balance file. So here I'm on the stats tab. And then within this ribbon, my first option is to start with all documents. So I'll go ahead and click that. So here again is the data editor. So it looks very much like a spreadsheet. So we have a row essentially for each document, and then a column for every variable that's added. So this is just the raw data that you're looking at. Your data set, if you're looking at your own file, might look a little bit different than mine, just because I play with this often. So I added different variables and probably made some changes to it that you might not have. And that's, the purpose of this example file. I highly encourage you to use it, or any of the other example files, of course. So this is the data editor. So I'm down at the bottom of my screen, and I'm going to click the tab for the variable list now. So again, similar to what we've looked at before in document variables, all of these at the top are in red. So those are system-generated variables. And then all of these here in blue are variables that I've added. So it gives me the variable, a label for it. So this is, nice. You could have, say, if it's survey data or questionnaire data, you could have the full item or question listed here. You can specify the variable type. You can specify if there are specific value labels. So I'll go ahead and click on this. So for example, if you have categorical data and a 1 is equal to low and a 2 is equal to medium and a 3 is equal to high, you can specify those value labels within here as well. This format is very similar, in my opinion, to SPSS if you've used SPSS. You can then specify missing values as well. So in this case, -999 is coded as a missing value. And then you can specify the level of measurement. So these are based on just the, really widely used Stevens scales of measurements. Is it nominal, ordinal, interval? Ratio is not included. It would be treated as interval data in this. The source, and then whether you want that to actually show up or be displayed or not. So you can, kind of use this to limit what actually is included as you're looking at your list or as you're, running a particular analysis. So it does give you a few options. And then finally, the output viewer. So these are outputs from analyses that I've run already and I've saved in the output viewer. But let's take a look at how to actually do some of those. And I'll show you how to include it in the output viewer. So we have options at the top. We can transform our data, so we can compute a new variable. So, if you have a set of items that comprise a scale, you could calculate a scale score, for instance. You could recode into new variables. So maybe you have an item that was reverse coded, or you just simply need to change a coding scheme. You could do that and create either a new variable or just do it in the same variable. So then on to descriptives. I'll start with descriptives just because I tend to start with descriptives before frequencies, but we'll look at frequencies as well next. So here's a list of all potential variables that I could include. So I'm just going to come down to these survey items really related to, satisfaction with life. So I'll take these items and I can either highlight them and click the arrow, or I can drag them over as well. So if I drag them over, it's really saying that these are the variables that I'm going to focus on. You can split a variable. So, let's say you want to compare on some kind of a categorical variable based on gender identity or something else. You could do that, or maybe you have an intervention and a control group. You could split based on that as well. And then it gives me a choice of what descriptive statistics I want to obtain. So one of my favorite features with this is that it actually is appropriately giving you a choice if your standard deviation is based on a sample formula, the standard deviation formula for a sample versus a population, and then also variance if it's based on a sample or a population. So, specify what's appropriate based on your data, and then I'll just ask for the minimum, I'll ask for the maximum, and I'll obtain a 95% confidence interval for the mean as well. So I'll click OK. And here are my descriptive statistics. So at this point, I've just run this. It's actually not saved into an output viewer. So I have these icons over here to save them in my output viewer. I can click this first one to insert it. And then you can see here that it actually opened the output viewer, and it just took this and it just saved it right here. So this is everything that I asked for: sample size, mean, standard deviation, minimum, maximum. And then we have the confidence interval around the mean, the upper and lower bounds of that. There's another option. If you have, say, multiple results, you can include all of those results. We'll look at an example of that in just a moment. But again, it's your choice what you want to save in an output viewer. So that's a good thing. It also means you need to remember to save these. As with most tools now, you can also just send this to your QTT as well if you have a QTT worksheet. So again, for that iterative mixed methods analysis, going back and forth, you could just save that in a worksheet, and then you'll have that when you go back to it. It does give me some options as well to generate a graph or a chart. So I'll come over to my chart viewer, and it gives me options. So I'll just select kind of this middle one. These are just box plots comparing each of these variables. I could instead ask for a histogram. So I'll change to histogram. And then here it gives me a little menu option where I can choose what variable I want to focus on for the histogram. So at this point, I've obtained quite a few charts. So let's say I want to save all of those into my output viewer. So I'll click on this next icon to insert all charts into my output viewer. And then if we look down at my output viewer, I'll get this out of the way. You can see that all of those charts were indeed saved. You have options you can format. So for instance, I can display a title or turn the title off. I can turn the scale or grid lines off or on. I can display an axis label as well. So I can choose to do that. I can change colors. You can play with this in quite a few different ways, actually. If you're not saving it to an output viewer, you can also just export this as well, or you could print it. So you could export as a Word document, really however you want to use it. So I'll go ahead and close this, and now I'll go to frequencies. So we'll come back to frequencies. So here I'm going to focus on more categorical variables where it makes sense to obtain frequencies. So I'll just grab a couple here just for our purposes. And this is, I should have mentioned earlier, this is where if you've specified a matrix, a set of matrix questions, you can obtain those from this little tab as well. So, I've grouped all of these items, these satisfaction items, as a satisfaction matrix. So I could get to that as well here. But I'm just showing frequencies, so I'll focus on that. So I have just these two variables that I'm asking for frequencies for. So here it gives me a little menu to toggle through which variable I want to look at. So relationship status or education level. And, these are just nice little tables, nothing, unusual about them. I can save these in my output viewer, just as I've done before. I could also go over to a chart. So it gives me a few options. So I could do more of a column graph, or I could change to a bar chart. So it's more horizontal. And again, I have formatting options as well. So this is a really nice way to, potentially visualize categorical data if you have something like that. So, even if you have what you think is, a purely qualitative study, if you have document variables, you could use this, the stats package, just to obtain descriptive demographic characteristics of your sample and be able to report those in your results section. So it's a way you can do that really easily without having to go to, Excel or a stats package or something else in order to do that. So those are more descriptive analyses. I did mention that about defining a matrix question set. So I'll just show you how to do that briefly, and then we'll move on to some of the inferential analyses next. So you can see I've already defined one matrix matrix question set. So let me just delete these so we can just look at it again. So I called this satisfaction, and then I can choose essentially what variables I want to include in that. So let's see. So I can include this one. I'll just drag it over. And then I'll include this one too. So now that I've defined that as a matrix question set, it then gives me that option when I went to the descriptives, and the frequencies is where we saw it, where I had an option to access these matrix questions as well. So again, it can be just a helpful way to organize your data if you do have something set up in scales or sections of a survey, so that you can kind of focus on those one at a time. All right, so a question, can survey data variables be added to a project that has already been coded? Yes, of course. That's, most often how I actually do that. And then will the data import as new documents, or can it be added to existing documents? So I'll address that while I'm moving over here. You can absolutely attach that to existing documents using that import wizard. What's really important is that whatever file you're importing from, say it's an Excel file, that your group, your document group, and your document name are an exact match. So let's say you have an identifier number, a unique identifier assigned to each participant. As long as the document, say a transcript, has the exact same name as that row in your Excel file, it will match for you, and it will just append those variables to your existing file. All right. So moving on then with some of these inferential analyses. The first is a crosstab, and a crosstab is not really inferential. This is, it's also sometimes called a contingency table in statistics, but it's a way to look at categorical variables. So in this case, I've arrayed two different categorical variables in this crosstab. So as rows, we have relationship status, and then as columns, we have employment status. So it will, give you a cross tabulation of that, so you can see, how many people fall into each of those unique cells. But then what I can do is obtain association measures. So it's this first, this icon right here. So it sort of looks like a circle with a vertical line going through it. And that gives me, that gives me these association measures, which I have here. So Pearson chi-squared, it gives me degrees of freedom, my significance, and then it also gives me coefficient C, and then also a Kramer's V as well. So I can, use that then to note, whether the patterns I see here are different than what you would expect, or, something that could likely be due to chance. So in essence, does there appear to be some kind of relationship or correlation between relationship status and employment status? Those are the type of questions that I can answer through this. So a t-test is another option. So through a t-test, we can compare groups. And the t-test, and it's labeled as such in MAXQDA, is an independent samples t-test. So that's assuming that you have basically a different group A and a different group B. They're not the same participant. So let's say you have an intervention group and a control group. You could compare those. So these are under compare groups. So if you select t-test, it opens this dialog box, gives you your variables. You can then specify your dependent variables. So this is for comparing means. So specify what dependent variables you want to compare means of. And then you specify the groups by dragging it over and then specifying a value for group 1 and group 2. And then it will essentially indicate, whether the difference in means appears to be statistically significant or not. Through one click, as you drag over multiple variables, you can run multiple t-tests at once, and then it will give you those. So an analysis of variance is another option. So if you're comparing 2 or more groups on a particular factor. So for this example right here, I have, again, multiple dependent variables included. These are all satisfaction variables. And then the factor that I have right here is what is your relationship status? So on a categorical variable, it will compare those groups and again indicate if they do appear to be statistically significantly different or not. You can also obtain a cluster analysis through that. So this is kind of grouping similar cases based on a set of variables that you choose. And what that generates is something like you see on the bottom here, which is more of a topology table of clusters. So it identified based on what I asked for here, 3 different clusters, and then it gives me some descriptive characteristics of each of those clusters. So, you know, most are grouping into cluster 3, if you see right here. But this is a hierarchical cluster analysis. You can also obtain correlations, so we can look at correlations in a moment as well. That's where I'm going to try to wrap up in just a few moments so we have more time for questions. So you have a couple of options for correlations. This is just based on a Pearson's correlation, so looking at linear relationships between 2 or more continuous or interval type variables. So when you run a correlation statistic, a Pearson correlation, you can again enter more than 2 variables. You can enter as many as you want, honestly, assuming it fits your research questions. And then it produces this correlation matrix. So in general, how often, these are satisfaction, how often do you feel satisfied with work? So we see our correlation coefficient as correlated with this first variable is 0.607. We have a p-value and then an n that's included in that. You can choose what you want to display in each cell of the correlation matrix. So you can toggle off the n if you would like, and you could also toggle off the p-value if you would like. There's also an option, it's this first icon right here, that will allow you to highlight what are significant correlations, which is nice. You can then focus on those. And with all of these, you can export it, or you can send it to your output viewer, you can export it, and you can send it to your QTT worksheet as well. So then finally, scale analysis. This gives you an option. So let's say you're conducting perhaps a mixed method study where you use qualitative results to develop a scale, then maybe you're analyzing the performance of a scale or a survey. You can run a scale analysis. So by default, it's giving you a Cronbach's alpha, also called a coefficient alpha, depending on where you land. It's somewhat controversial on the term of alpha, so I tried to stay out of it and just call it alpha. But for this set of items right here, so it's giving me a Cronbach's alpha of 0.926 based on 66 cases. And it's saying there were 15 cases that were missing. And then it gives you some specific data about that, as you would expect to see in this. So it gives me the mean and the standard deviation, and it tells me what it would actually be or what it would change to without that item. It gives me a corrected item total scale correlation. So remember, this is internal consistency reliability. So it's looking at whether these items tend to sort of hang together with one another. And then it's telling me what would happen to my alpha if I would delete this item. So this is a really easy way to pick out poorly performing items. So it's saying that my Cronbach's alpha was 0.926, but my alpha would increase to 0.94 if I would remove that item. That's not a huge jump. You know, if it's going to jump from 0.7 to 0.9, you know, that might be a good candidate for deletion, but that's kind of beyond the scope of our talk right here. So let me just quickly go back over to MAXQDA. I'll wrap up in just a minute and just show you where to access some of these, and then we'll have questions. So for compare groups, we've looked at these. So for crosstabs, it gives you a dialog box where you can specify your rows and your columns. For a t-test, again, you can drag over what particular variables you're interested in. I mentioned you can specify groups, so I can come and I can choose what groups I want to compare. And then finally, for compare groups, I'll just show the analysis of variance. You can very similarly do something similar. So I can choose my dependent variables, so it will run multiple ANOVAs at once, and then I can specify my factor for a correlation. So I can select Pearson. There's also a Spearman correlation. So if you have rank order data, you could use that, but I'll just show a Pearson. So it's limiting this to interval data that are included here. So I'll just select a few of these, drag them over, and this is just the correlation matrix that I obtained already. So it gives me this. I just wanted to show briefly that I can highlight what's statistically significant. In this case, all relationships were. I could turn off the N, I could turn off the p-value, And then I could also, move over to some charts. And then, of course, I can save this to my output viewer as well. All right, so I talked a little bit longer than I anticipated, so I do apologize to that. But let me go back over and look at the questions and see if there are any questions. So are all of the inferential analyses bivariate rather than multivariate? I would say, yeah, at this point they are. I mean, it's a limited stats package. It's not going to do what you could do in Stata or SPSS or something like that. But yeah, typically it would be bivariate. There's no, currently no regression analysis, for instance. Good question. Another question, are the t-test independent samples, or do we also have paired? Currently, independent samples t-test is the only one that's available. So if you had a paired samples t-test, you'd have to run a different one. Or if you had a t-test where you're just comparing to a reference group, again, you'd have to use another package to do that. And then a question, reason you cannot add columns to an Excel document in MAXQDA. I'm not quite sure the answer to that. I assume you mean within the document browser and editing it, but I apologize. I'm not quite sure the answer to that particular question about editing an Excel document. Other questions that I might be able to address or help with? Okay. Great question. Is there a way to work with the time dimension? So transcripts or protocols have timestamps, and I like to analyze those quantitatively. That's a great question. I can't think of a way off the top of my head. I mean, it depends on what you would do. I mean, you could potentially create a document variable based on those timestamps. So, for instance, if you, I'm trying to think about a particular transcript. So if you have, for instance, a timestamp, I suppose you could probably find a way to auto code those timestamps and then convert those to a document variable and do something with it. But I'd have to think about other options for doing that. That's not something that I've tried to do, at least being able to extract that data statistically. I'll think about that and let you know if I can think of any way to do that. But that's a good idea. It's an interesting idea. And I assume it would also be nice if you could, look at the timestamp, but you might want to calculate, how many minutes elapsed between those. And I'm not sure of a way off the top of my head where you might be able, how you would do that, but it's a good question. Other questions? Okay. Does working with a stats module require to transform all coding data into document variables? No, you don't have to transform anything. In the examples that I looked at and in my work, I've not really done any data transformation at all. I've imported or added document variables to a transcript, so it's more thinking of individuals as the unit of analysis. I've added variables to those individuals, but you certainly don't have to do any kind of data transformation. And there was a next question here. How do you get to the stats feature of MAXQDA? It might depend, if you're not seeing it, it might depend on what version of MAXQDA you have. I'll go to MAXQDA. So this is available on the Analytics Pro version. And if you don't have it, you can download a free trial of this as well. But there's a little menu option. It's kind of near the end, right before Team Cloud. You can come to Stats. And then at that point, you can start with all documents. So then it's just taking all of your document variables, or you can import another file as well. So that's how you get to the stats module within MAXQDA. Other questions? I believe I've addressed everything that's in here. So here's another one. When working on meta-analyses with statistical calculations included, can you still use stats included with MAXQDA? Yeah, of course you could do that. You can add really any variable you want, and it can be based on your document system or based on something else. So, for a meta-analysis, you could add some of those calculations to a document variable, to a document, if that would help, or you could start with an entirely different data set and use that. So yes, absolutely, all those are options. Good question. Other questions? Okay. All right. Well, I will go ahead and mute my video. I'll watch the chat for a few more moments. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to watch to reach out to me. Thanks to everyone for joining this. I really appreciate you taking time out to learn a little bit about the stats package. Again, it's a really nice little stats package. Depending on your research questions, it might be everything you need. And it can be really nice for mixed method studies and being able to go back and forth, especially, now that you can insert those outputs into your QTT as well and think about how your qualitative and quantitative results together really build to new insights or meta inferences within a mixed method study. So thanks for joining. Again, I will go on mute, but feel free to add questions in the chat if you have anything, and I'll watch it.